I'll have to show where this is on Google Earth because it's not as easy to get to as you'd think. But the coast in front of me right now is a part of Operation Hardtack 28. Now, Hardtack 28 was part of a series of operations of the British Commandos. They weren't intended to be anything like D-Day. They weren't intended to win any battles. They would bring these commandos in to covertly accomplish a mission goal, which was for Hardtack 28 to capture a German soldier and bring him back to Britain for interrogation regarding how many Germans were on this island. We now know that there were something about 10,000 Germans on this island, which is only, I think, 9 miles wide and 4 miles, tall. But they were incredibly lucky because this entire coast along here was mined very heavily because it was a German military training area. But the lucky part about it was that there were no Germans actively in the area at the time. So what happened was they were supposed to land at this island right here, but I believe they walked right up these cliffs because they had to move from the island because of the possibility of people catching wind of the operation. The operation took place on Christmas, and if I remember correctly, one man took the place of another man, another sergeant who wanted to spend Christmas with his family, and this man would later end up dying in Hardtack 28. So on Christmas morning, I believe in around 0200, they come up here, and there's a building around here that I'll try to find called Wolf's Lair, which is a nickname for a farmhouse. And they proceeded through this heavy jungle to a place called La Rue Egypte. I think it's Egyptian route. And they met a family up there in a barn house. And these commandos very much intimidated them. They were covered in black face paint. They were very heavily armed. And the family basically refused to talk to them at first. At first, the woman answered the door. She was so frightened she couldn't talk. And then her brother answered the door, who was also so frightened that he couldn't even speak. And they shouted at them in German, "No, we won't help you," because they thought that they were going to be Germans trying to test the loyalty of the islanders. Eventually, when they gained their trust, they let them in. They interviewed them somewhat. But surprisingly, they didn't find any Germans because it was a military training ground. And they had to retreat pretty soon before the sun was out because German patrols were all over the island and they had to operate under cover of darkness. It was somewhere in these woods that one of the officers, or one of the sergeants rather, stepped on a landmine and was mortally wounded. They managed to get him back to a boat that was waiting out here, and they could only communicate with lantern lights, and those were very dim. You had to know where to look to see the lights. But they got him back, and he died, I believe, in Dover. And it was several years later that a child found the dagger that he recognized as being from the British Commandos. And it really speaks volumes to how terrified the British were of the Channel Islands. They were occupied pretty much immediately by the Nazis. And the Nazis, of all of the Atlantic seawall, from France up to Belgium, they really did believe that they needed to use the majority of that. I believe someone said something like 60–80% of all the cement used in the seawall had to be used at the Channel Islands because Hitler's order was to turn this into an impenetrable island, basically as a symbolic act, because they didn't want Churchill to regain control of it. And they really thought that holding these Channel Islands would be the main victory, at least moral victory of the war, a snub in the nose, a snub in the face to Winston Churchill and the Western powers. And these islands were basically cut off from everything else. And having 10,000 Germans on this island, like I showed you in earlier videos, you can get anywhere in about 30 minutes from one side of the island to the other. And imagine trudging through all this as a British commando with all your gear, trying to avoid landmines and hitting one. So at the bottom of this hill, you can see over here is where they were supposed to land initially, but their boat was kind of floating in the water over there, and they were communicating with a dim lantern. And I believe they dropped them off just down the hill here. And their plan of operation was to come up into the civilian area above me, capture a German soldier, and then leave and bring him back to England for interrogation. So here you have the Wolf's Lair, which is the first building they had a rendezvous in. And they expected that there would be, the whole area would be crawling with Nazis. They expected to run into somebody literally by this point. That's how heavily occupied this island was. Well, they didn't realize that this was a training area. If you look around their rendezvous point, and they basically went up this hill, I'd say it's about a 10-minute walk to the nearest building if you're going fast. If you're If you're Commando, it's like a 2-minute run. But here you've got an interesting memorial bench to the Special Boat Service. Some hardcore dudes. And actually, I was corrected here. The memorial is to Officer, he was an officer, Captain P.A. Dayton, who died and was taken to, he was in Devon when he died. He was brought to the hospital, but he died soon after the raid. There actually were no bullets fired in this. They were intentionally supposed to be very, very quiet and covert. This wasn't like shock troops, this wasn't an operation to kill anybody, and unfortunately he just happened to step on a mine. And from what I've read on the forums, some child found the Commando's knife. Could have been dropped by anybody, because at the point where the mine went off, they would probably have been freaking out and scrambling to get their guys out to the bay and to the boat before they were detected by any Germans that could have been in the area. Because once you make a loud noise like that, you give your position away.